I love love, and everything that like gives me the opportunity to share love with people, like I'm about it. So, it made me thinking about today and this topic, and today being Valentine's Day, made me think about the Dr. Cornel West quote, that justice is what love looks like in public. And I think that's what we're talking about today, right? Like, it's not about buzzwords. It's not about, doing something because it checks boxes. It's because this is about love, right? And it's about showing that in public. So that's my Valentine's Day introduction. So I'm really happy to be here with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be, / terrified to be speaking in between Amir and Nubia, who are both phenomenal, brilliant people who I respect and admire a lot. As you might notice that I'm signing and talking. So that's called simcomming. This is where you sign and talk at the same time. I generally don't do it, but recently, has anyone heard of an activist named Judith Herman? Raise your hand if you've heard of her. No one? Oh my God, well, I'm so excited for you. So Judith is probably one of the most important disability advocates and activists of all time. She founded an organization called Disabled in Action. And she, when she was young, so kind of how she got her start in this world, the activist world, is that she went to school to become a teacher. She had polio as a child, so she uses a wheelchair. And she went to get a job at the New York public school system, and they wouldn't let her teach because they said, and this is one of the things that they literally said, that she was a fire hazard. Yeah, because she was in a wheelchair. So anyway, so she sued them and said, just because I'm disabled and I use a wheelchair doesn't mean I can't teach. She's one of the smartest women in the whole world. So anyway, so I was very lucky to get to meet her. I was like, oh my God, I'm obsessed with you, you're my hero. It was a little embarrassing for me. But the next day, she saw me at another Sundance event, and she saw me signing, and she was like, why didn't you sign during the panel? And I was like, well, there were no deaf people in the audience, and I tend to, if there's no deaf people, I just voice off, I don't sign, and then if there are deaf people, I'll choose to sometimes voice off and just sign. And she's like, no, you shouldn't do that. You should be signing at the same time. And when Judith Herman tells you to do something, you do it. So that's why I'm doing this. It's my first time, so thank you for being a friendly, supportive audience. I mean, I've done presentations in just sign language before, but generally what we say is that if you simcom, you lose one language, right? Because you're literally using two different languages at the same time, right? So two completely different sentence structures, and so generally you're going to lose some of your fluency in usually one of the languages. So anyway, that was a long introduction, but here we go. So I thought about for this presentation if I wanted to talk about in general just about disability inclusion in the arts, but really I think that there's such a big conversation missing about disability in general that it feels like we shouldn't even get into that until we have an honest conversation about disability itself. So I'm also going to talk about the intersectionality of disability with other types of justice work, but just a few kind of things I wanted to say about disability. The census estimate, 1 in 5 people have a disability in the US, and that's just self-reporting. And what do we know about self-reporting is that it's always under, right? So when we're talking about a group, I mean, that's a huge percentage. It's probably close to 25% if you don't include just self-reporting, right? So when people talk about disability, and a lot of times when I talk with people about accessibility and inclusion, something that people will say is, well, we just don't have a lot of people with disabilities who come to our organization or our event. And I'm like, well, that's not true. You have a lot of people with disabilities who come. You just don't know that they're disabled. Or people with disabilities aren't coming because you're not accessible, right? And so it's a huge population. And within that, population, it's incredibly diverse. So I loved what Amir said about if the work is easy, you're not doing it right. That's so true. And I think that that's especially true with disability work, because I, have been doing disability advocacy work for 15 years, but I really still make so many mistakes all the time because I have one disability. I'm very knowledgeable about my own disability, but there's like 1,000 others, right? And for each person with a disability, that shows up in a different way, right? And so there's so much diversity and difference and how diversity expresses itself and what people's needs are. So I want to tell just a couple short stories about my own experience with disability in the arts. So I became the executive director of Art Access 3 years ago, and I moved from Seattle for the job, and pretty soon people are so welcoming here. That's been really my experience. So I got invited to lots of events by different arts organizations, and which felt so nice, because being new and moving to a new place, and it's so hard to make friends as an adult. Like, why is it so hard as an adult to make friends, right? But so I got invited to see a film screening, and it was actually about the topic of disability, and I said, I would love to come. Will it be subtitled? And they said, well, actually, no. But next year, if you want to bring your clients, maybe we can work something out. And I was like, I didn't say anything about clients. Why is that assumption being made? Is it because you can't imagine that I, the executive director of an organization, might be asking for accommodations for myself? Right? Like, what does that say? So I felt really crummy about it, and I sent an email at 10 p.m. that was like, I think you need to check yourself. And I felt bad because I'm like, can you imagine reading that email at 10 p.m.? Like, oh, come on. Like, we've all done that, right? But it made me think of an experience that I had growing up that was really formative. It was in my 10th grade English class. We were watching the autobiography of Malcolm X, the great film. And, at this point, I was pretty comfortable advocating for myself. So when, the teacher started to pull it up, I was like, can I have the captions, please? And one kid, some punk in the back, was like, do we have to? And everyone looked her up and was like, and then he was made eye contact with me, and he was like, oh, sorry, But the teacher, who had already started to put on the captions, then went, you know what, we're just gonna do it the normal way. So we're all just like, and I'm just humiliated. I can't understand anything in movies without captions. So halfway through the movie, the teacher stands up and goes, Shandra, it's getting a little more complicated now, so if you want to put on the captions, you can, and holds the remote. So I had to get up, walk up, grab the remote, turn it on myself. And I was just humiliated, right? And it's that idea, right, that the captions were needed because it's complicated, not because I just can't hear, right? That I'm not smart enough to understand the film, right? That was the subtext. So then when I get this email from this, about the accommodations, it just brings me right back to that, right? That moment being in 10th grade and being humiliated. So I think that is why it's so important that we talk about equity and inclusion and diversity in this kind of justice-centered way, because these aren't just small moments. They might be a small moment in time, but it's connected to all of the experiences of oppression that you experience throughout your life. Perfect. Why is it important to talk about disability? Obviously, it's important to talk about disability because we, care about people, and but also it's important that we think about disability in terms of when we talk about the different types of diversity, because it's all intersectional, right? And that you could say that about any issue, whether it's gender, race, sexuality, economic status. But also, I think it's important to acknowledge that disability shows up differently for different people in different communities, right? So, for example, if we're not talking about disability, when we're talking about equity, you can have an example where a child who is having, let's use the example of anxiety, because I definitely live with anxiety. Anxiety is part of the human condition. I would love, please, Amir, can you run and get rid of our anxiety? But you might have a child who is going through a lot at home, high anxiety. How did that show up in the classroom? Probably behavior, right? So if it's a white child, they might get questions, what's going on at home? Maybe it's mental health, let's get them help, let's get them signed up with an IEP, right? But if it's a Latino child or a black child, maybe they just get labeled as having behavior problems. And we know statistically that happens, right? And so who gets to be disabled even? Who gets diagnosed with a disability versus just being considered a problem? There's a great disability activist named Mingus, who we're going to talk about in a sec, who talks about we need to get rid of this idea of just inclusion, access to what we already have, because what we already have is a broken system for a lot of people. So when we're talking about court, right, who cares if we have a ramp? If a black person using a wheelchair doesn't have equal justice to a white person using a wheelchair, right? That just kind of loses the point. So I think that's why it's also so important to think about disability in the context of other types of justice too, right? Because if we, build a ramp, but we're still discriminating in other ways and we're still haven't torn down the broken system, we're just perpetuating the same kind of oppression. So kind of my brief thoughts on disability and intersectionality. Okay, so Mia Mingus. So I really thought that this quote really brought home what I wanted to share today. So Mia Mingus is an incredible disability activist. I highly recommend looking her up and reading her stuff. But I'm just going to read this quote. So access for the sake of access is not necessarily liberatory, but access for the sake of connection, breaking isolation, love, justice, and liberation is liberatory. There is plenty of access being done that is not liberatory. Many times, access is done as a quick fix, an ad, or just tell me what to do and I'll do it, kind of angry or guilty shuffling. Most access right now is about inclusion and equality. How do we bring disabled people to our table? How do we make sure disabled people have access to what we have? Rather than thinking that the entire table and system might need to change. I feel like, did we plan our presentation all together? Because, same brain. And I think that really gets to the heart of the matter, is as much as we can think about these fixes, and we should think about fixes, right? That's not to say that you don't need to build that ramp, you don't need to get caption devices, you don't need to get interpreters, right? It's not to say that those things aren't important and necessary. It's that if that's all you're doing, you're not really making access and inclusion and equity happen. I wanted to talk a little bit about a project that we're doing, which I'm actually so happy because the people that I'm doing it with are in the room. So you can go to the next slide. This is another great quote to kind of lead us in. So anyway, the project's called Breaking Barriers, and we're doing it with the Utah Division of Arts and Museums. So a quick shout out to Jean and Vicki and Jen, who are three of my favorite people in the whole world. And we're really tackling this issue of how do we help shift the perspective on accessibility and access in the arts sector. And I think that the arts sector, I think someone else already said this, but is the perfect place for us to be looking at justice work because we're creative people, right? So this is a great quote by Sinead Burke, who is a little person who is a fabulous model from Ireland. And so she said, so many of my challenges were not because of a genetic mutation, but caused by the lack of creative thinking by those in power. So I think that really speaks to why we are in the perfect place to do this work. So breaking barriers, the basic idea, also this is from the CRIP camp screening, so shout out to Sundance. And this is Judith right here. Anyway, so, but really the point of this project is to say, you know, we have not done enough around accessibility in this state when it comes to the arts and people with disabilities. We're still behind, and there's still so many people having really horrible experiences. And we have the ability, people care about this issue, like we are in the right place to really dive in and address it. So, Breaking Barriers, the point is for us to do education and training around making the arts more accessible. But it's a very different kind of training than a lot of other people, that a lot of people might go to. A lot of times we talk about the checklist, right? Like this is what you need to be ADA accessible, this is what you should do, these are best practices. Not that those aren't good things, but if we're not telling the stories of people with disabilities, if we're not teaching the history, if we're not talking about the bigger systems that have created this problem in the first place, then your organizations won't be accessible and you won't totally understand the issue. And so we're developing training. Yay! So anyway, so it's a 3-year project that we're in the middle of year 2 on. And so we're developing, or we've mostly developed, a 12-hour accessibility curriculum specifically for arts organizations. We have 3 training cohorts. The first one just started like 2 weeks ago. And so 24 cultural organizations will be taking this training. And they'll have up to 4 people from each organization. So we'll probably end up training 50 to 75 arts professionals. At the end of the training, so after 3 separate sessions, it'll really be 15 hours, but it's 12 hours of content, each organization will create an accessibility plan. So they'll line up, these are the barriers that we see in our organization, these are how we're gonna address it, and then they'll also get 5 hours of consultation with me, and then we're also doing a lot of review and evaluation and assessment of the curriculum and then updating it. And then, what's the really exciting thing is that New Dam plans to take it statewide. And that's the goal of developing it this way so that it can be taken statewide. So, yeah, so that is really kind of what we're doing. It's a great example of partnership so we have funding with a private foundation, so the Dumpke Jr. Foundation, so we talk about philanthropy, right? Like this is a great example of nonprofit, government, and foundation work, right? And like how we can all partner together to really not just do a surface level or a Band-Aid on an issue, right? But really do a deep dive and address the issue at its core. So, yeah, thank you.